Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to our first live stream COVID style. We are not at UCLA campus this time. We're actually in the virtual world. And conveniently, we are actually going to talk about the pandemic. The title of this live stream is How the Pandemic Will Change the Landscape of Children's Media. This is the Center for Scholars and Storytellers. And to remind you, we're broadcasting on Facebook Live, and you will be able to type in questions at any time. So we are very, very lucky to have today with us Nancy Kanter, who both of these women have like a billion titles, so I'll let them sort of elaborate on what they do. But Nancy Cantor is the Executive Vice President of Content and Creative Strategy at Disney Channels Worldwide, and she also runs Disney Junior Worldwide. Ellen Wartella has a whole bunch of professorships, but I'm going to mention the Professor of Communication. She's also at Northwestern University, and we are very, very lucky to have her as a collaborator who works with us frequently at the Center for Scholars and Storytellers. So I'm going to take it away and let these two women start and talk to each other and have a conversation. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Yalda. Ellen, nice to have a chance to chat.
It is nice to have a chance to chat, Nancy. So do you want to go first about what you're doing these days?
Sure.
Background, I guess, is what we're supposed to talk about.
Yeah, my background, I've been at Disney for almost 20 years. It will be 20 years in March. And I actually had started out on the production side of movies. I was a film editor for many years, working on feature films, and then I made my way oddly and unexpectedly to Sesame Street, where I worked on some of the projects there as an executive producer for about 5 years, and then took up my role at Disney Channels, in particular focusing for the first part of my career on preschool programming, and really built the business for Disney that was primarily aimed at kids 2 to 5. We created some series that have gone on to sort of be somewhat culture changing. I developed a show, Doc Mcstuffins, which was the first time that an African American little girl who was the lead. She wanted to be a doctor like her mom, and she took up being doctor to broken toys and stuffed animals. It became quite a phenomenon, both in the entertainment world, but also did an enormous amount to highlight people of color and to really focus on giving them some inspirational models and look at the way that little girls in particular could look at becoming involved in science and medical medicine. And then about 3 years ago, I added to my plate of preschool by taking on the live action and animation content at Disney Channels that's aimed at sort of kids 6 to 11. We do series, we do movies, we do animated shows. And essentially my job, sometimes I kind of laugh and sort of have to pinch myself, because essentially my job is just giving my opinion to people about what kinds of shows we should be making. What is the content strategy for them? How are they both serving an need and a content need, but also serving the business need at Disney Channels and at the Disney company? So pretty much every creative decision that goes into what we put on the air flows through me at one point or another. I obviously have teams of executives who handle the day in, the day out, but at the end, they look to me and say, should we do this or should we not do this? I come at it, and that's why I'm so happy to sort of be part of this virtual conversation, because I really come at it from a storyteller's perspective. That's where my heart is. That's where I started as a film editor. You're really looking at story and performance and how do you tell the story the best way possible in sound and pictures. And so I look at everything from that, very much that storyteller's perspective, even though now my job and my title seems to indicate a different kind of role as an executive. But if it doesn't speak to me from a story perspective, it's very hard for me to necessarily do my job well. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what I do on a day-to-day basis. Give a lot of opinions.
Yeah, I think that's what I do, is give a lot of opinions too. Well, I've been in the same sort of place since I was in graduate school. I started doing research as a graduate student at the University of Minnesota many decades ago. And my work since then has always been sort of the same sort of work. I do research at the nexus of public questions about media and technology in children's lives. Developmental psychology, what do we know about children of different ages and how they make sense of different kinds of content and programming, and media studies, what do we know about the way different kinds of technologies and media present information and influence children. So right now I'm at Northwestern University. I've been at other universities. I've been somewhat peripatetic, but I've always been doing research in that area. Right now I run a center on media and human development, and I have some research grants studying a variety of things, STEM education and how you get children interested in science, technology, engineering, and math, particularly young children, and some work on social media with adolescents is what I'm doing right now. But over the years, I've studied such public questions, starting off with the role of advertising and how advertising influences young children's behavior. And so very early on, in fact, it was a heady experience. As a first-year assistant professor, I testified at the Federal Trade Commission hearings on the role of advertising in children's lives, and that's when the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, had recommended banning all advertising to children too young to understand advertising's persuasive influence, and that was based on my research. So that was the work that I had done as a graduate student with my advisor, Dan Wackman. From there, a little bit later, I got involved in the TV violence studies when the National Cable Television Association in the late 90s hired a violence monitor, and I was part of the research team. There were 4 universities involved: UCSB, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and at the time I was at the University of Texas. And we were the monitor for looking at how violence was portrayed throughout cable television, and we had to testify several times at congressional hearings about that topic. And that led to actually having the different kinds of, what are those things called where it tells you what's coming up, the rating system, that we were involved in evaluating that and using that. So then I got involved in the violence studies, and then moving into the early 2000s, in the middle of the 2000s, with the rise of the childhood obesity epidemic, I went back to one of my earlier studies and began looking at the role of food marketing in the rise of childhood obesity. It continues to be a problem. So I was involved with the Institute of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences, ran some meetings for them and some investigations, and looked again at how really the kinds of foods that we market to children is really having an impact in the rise of obesity over the last 20 or 30 years. And recently, I've gotten involved, as I said, in STEM concerns, because we're a country that is trying to raise the profile of getting more children interested in science and technology, and how can tech media help do that. So I've been working with 4 to 7-year-olds actually in ways using apps and television shows and a whole variety of mechanisms to see if we can encourage their interest in science and math. And just one little tidbit there, it's really interesting. Parents, even of these young children, feel very comfortable teaching math, but are very anxious about teaching science. And so we have to, as a social scientist, I think it's interesting that we have to go a bit further and explain that. All that said, it means that now that we're in this COVID crisis and we have a social issue at the table, that's sort of been the area that I've worked in over the years. I've been an advisor to a lot of different organizations. I was on the Sesame Street board for 20 some years, went off about 2 years ago. And I've been on the boards of other television shows as advisors and lots of advisory groups, but I'm really an academic and researcher and have continued to do research all in the area of children and media.
Right. Well, we have lots of overlap in ways. We work with, obviously, experts like yourself and academics, most especially on the preschool side, although we certainly, from time to time, on some of the older, when we have a specific area that we know we're trying to target or a specific issue that we're trying to get the best information as we possibly can, we work with lots of people. And I know our paths have crossed distantly, but now finally in person. So it's great. I mean, I would just say, I know that the theme of a changing landscape, and I think none of us, certainly I didn't. I'm not a science fiction reader, so I have to say I never in a million years imagined we would be finding ourselves in this situation that we're in. Apparently, though, science fiction writers have been writing about it and predicting it for decades, which is interesting. But I'll ask you, just because you've been in this space of great social and cultural landscape change. What do you think is what are you looking at in terms of your research next, and how to approach what we know is going to be sort of just a long-lasting and fundamental way, especially for children as they look at the world?
That's a good question. I think there's a lot of concern about how our children are going to cope with it and how our adolescents are going to cope with it. I don't have a crystal ball to see into the future, but I think that the experience, for however long it lasts, of families and kids being in front of screens a lot, which they are right now, they're home, and screens are not the enemy by any means. Screens are their access to their friends, to their schooling, to their families outside, to their sense of the world. That I think we're going to view screens and screen use differently after this. I think that there's going to be an expanded role of using technology for a whole host of ways, including education and communication and information. And it's going to be a multiplicity of screens. It's not just going to be television, and it's not just going to be the tablets or the phone, but it'll be a multiplicity of things. And I suspect that after this, that much of the criticism about screens in young children's lives is going to be muted. Mm-hmm. Because it's not screens per se that's the problem with young children. It's what content are they engaging in, and can you provide things other than screen use? Doing anything for the 7 or 8 hours that kids are awake, or 12 hours, is not healthy. So you have to have some limits. But I think we're going to view screens differently. And then for you, the question is what kind of content that will help children cope with the changed world that they have. I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. I don't have all the answers, but maybe you'd like to speculate a little bit about that too. What do you think will be changing content as a consequence of this COVID experience?
Yeah. I mean, we were obviously, spending a lot of time thinking about that. And a couple of things. One is, I think we felt, especially on the Disney Channel side, which targets those kids sort of 6 and up, who are very aware of what's going on. Preschoolers have some sense, but they're pretty sheltered, other than maybe not going to preschool and being home a lot more. But we felt we had initially, a certain responsibility to address it for our audience, who we know looks to Disney Channel, whether they're watching it on YouTube, or they're watching it linearly, or they're watching it on our digital apps. They're looking for some information, and looking for more than information. They're looking for us for sort of support and comfort. That's always been the place that I think our brand and our channel has really thrived, is feeling part of their world in that sense of security and comfort.
I completely agree with you. Disney is in my mind one of the companies that has done the best for taking care of children and its content.
And sometimes, it's interesting, because you have to make that choice of, do we pretend like everything is fine and just give you the nice feel-good message, or do we hit the message on the head, and do we really sort of talk very clearly and out front about it? And Disney it's typically been, when there have been things like 9/11 or Katrina or other kinds of natural disasters, we tended not to talk about them explicitly, but rather talk through the message of community, responsibility, family. In this case, and I'll scream for the group and for you, we felt we had to sort of about it a little more specifically and deliberately, because we knew this was just something that our audience, and in fact the world, had never experienced before. There wasn't a way to sort of soft pedal that. So in the first week, we went out to all of the talent on our series, and we asked them to just self-tape something that would be a message of, encouragement. We're all in this together, which is the phrase we keep hearing, so that kids had a sense of community with our talent, and that we were here recognizing what they were going through. It proved, very effective. We obviously track a lot of things on Instagram, Twitter, and just seeing those familiar faces that they're used to seeing in our shows, reassuring them and saying, hey, I'm sitting home just like you. Here are some tips. I'm taking long walks with my dog. I'm trying to do exercise. I'm listening to music, was something that the feedback we got was tremendously helpful. So I just thought for the audience, if you wanted to see, it's just a quick, less than a minute clip.
Hi everyone, it's Scarlett.
Hey guys, Albert here.
It's Ramon Reed here. I just wanted to let you guys know that we can get through this. It's about us coming together and lifting each other up.
Check in on your friends and see how they're doing during this time.
Stay in contact with your friends by video chatting or calling them.
Me and my best friend especially will call each other and on FaceTime, and we'll watch movies together. We'll just count to 3 and then we'll press play at the same time and we'll watch the movie together, and that's been helping a lot.
I have a really good friend named Sophia that I've been able to FaceTime, and it's made me feel a lot better about the situation.
We're going to get through this and definitely come out with stronger relationships.
We're all in this together.
Be kind to each other, and we can get through this.
Well, I'm glad that you chose to be much more explicit about it. I think this is an instance where the 6 and up really do know something's different, and to not label it and not talk about it, not comfort them, but make them understand that we are all experiencing the same thing, that they're not alone, is a really important message for 6 and up. Really, very important.
We felt, that you couldn't ignore it. And now the big question for us really is the content forward. And we haven't quite landed. I think it's something that everybody, not just in kids, but everybody in the sort of entertainment content landscape is thinking about. What the outcome of this will be. We don't know how long we might be wearing masks. We don't know how long you're going to have to practice some amount of social distancing, what events and activities are going to resume and what won't. And so how do we begin to think about the writing of stories going forward? If you were predicting that there might be one thing, who knows? So it's a tough ongoing conversation for us, which is, do we address it knowing that our timelines for production are usually anywhere from 6 to 18 months, and in the case of animated shows, it's even 3 years from the time you're actually writing something to the time it will hit the air or be on a screen somewhere. How do you begin to look at the stories that we're writing, and how do we predict what we're going to have to not only talk about, but what it's going to look like? I have to say, as I'm watching some television now, when I see 2 people in a show hug each other, or I see a big crowd scene, I go, oh, wait a minute. Because even at this moment, this early stage, it feels like we can't do that. And how will we begin to sort of create those stories that are going to feel not, again, sort of blind to the fact that we've gone through this, but will also represent where are we a year and a half from now in terms of our social interactions, in terms of how COVID has impacted us. And for kids in particular, where the stories tend to fall into sort of one of 2 categories. One is fantasy, where you go to a fantasy world, and there you can take a lot more liberty because you're not in the real world. A lot of our content on Disney Channel for the older kids is very grounded. It's schools, it's home, it's outdoor activities where it really feels grounded and very much of the moment. So we are wrestling with trying to predict something that we just frankly don't know. But my instinct is that we are going to have to address it on an ongoing basis, and in the way that Disney would not necessarily write a show about COVID, but we're going to have to start to reference some of the changes that I think are going to be significant and long lasting. So that is.
Yeah, I would think about it in 2 ways, that there are issues about COVID that might be taken up in the central part of the narrative. Are you going to tell a story about coping in a post-COVID world? And that is a very message-oriented, where you want to get your facts straight, and but you can tell the story of a family or kids and how they're coping and what their personal life is like. So that's kind of central. But then I understand what you're saying is that there's the surrounding, the more incidental, less central information, how you present the world, how you present people meeting when they're together, how you present going out to restaurants, or what's available. I mean, are we going to no longer have buttons to push on elevators, but we'll use our elbows? Handshakes are going to go out the window. And so there's those incidental expressions of the changes in social and cultural life. And boy, who knows what that's going to go. But I mean, it seems to me that those are two different issues. Will Disney take on the centrality of helping children realize the differences in their world and how they cope, or how families or different age groups of children, different kinds of careers cope, and institutions cope, versus this more presentation of the world that we look pretty different, and don't know exactly all the way that is. So you do have an issue, don't you, how you present?
And part of the presentational part is, we know just from the way we produce shows, we will have to produce them differently, right? The notion of when, if we go back into production in the fall or the winter, chances are, those scenes of, 100 kids in a hallway, a big dance, in a gym, sporting events, the things that we typically represent because they're part of kids' lives, we just literally physically won't be able to shoot that, because nobody's going to bring 300 extras to sit in bleachers or sit in a school gymnasium. So I think that will all just impact how we write. And then in terms of the sort of more centralization of including the story, it's interesting. We were at work before the pandemic hit on a series where it sort of goes back and forth in time between current modern day girl experiencing what 12, 13-year-olds do, and flashing back her father's days as a teenager in the 90s, and sort of comparing and contrasting sort of their experiences. He's a single dad raising his daughter, who sometimes is just a little too much like he was when he was his rebellious 12-year-old self. And their grandmother lives with them as well. And we were at work about a story that eerily sort of echoes what happened to us, which is in the present day, something happens in the world that causes sort of things to stop and be put on hold for our lead girl. And we were flashing back to talk about some of the events that happened, 9/11, which happened for the father when he was young, going further back for the grandmother, which I think is an interesting way to approach for kids, again, giving them that perspective and comfort. Yes, this is extraordinary, and maybe certainly once in a lifetime, if not once in a a century. But there is some perspective. This has happened before. We have had these sort of tragedies and challenges, and come out the other side. So that's one of the ways that we're looking at trying to frame up these central issues, but in a way that feels right again for us. I'm sorry, Near, you.
There was a question for Nancy, but could you put it up again, please, Near? I don't see the question. It popped up and it went away real fast. Okay, here's the question. Is there currently, or do you anticipate any sort of content developed? Please put it up again, Near. It's going away too fast. Do you anticipate any sort of content developed specifically aimed towards children's understanding of the COVID crisis? Will you take it on very specifically is the question.
Yeah, I think that's under discussion. I think that's what you and I have been, sort of batting around is, how specific will we take it on? Again, in the sort of more of the public service announcement format that I just showed that clip for, we've taken it on very specifically. I think our instinct is to find, again, because of what the Disney brand represents, is unlikely. We might do an episode. I don't think we would build multiple episodes in every series around it, or a movie around it. Again, I think as we were talking, people think of us as that safe release from whatever the stresses and strains of every day is. On the other hand, we don't want to look like we're putting our head in the sand and pretending like, oh no, everything's fine. And that's our challenge when you have a brand like Disney.
But you could take on sort of the social emotional needs of the kids who have gone through it. So you could take on how you deal with stress, how you deal with living in a much more small society where you can't move around quite as much or not travel. So you can take on the kind of stressors that the children are feeling, even if you don't explicitly say it's because of COVID. You just take on those stressors. And it also strikes me that another thing, I love that show idea that you have of going back, that there have been other periods where kids had to go through experiences all the way back to World War II or 9/11. I think that's great. It also strikes me that do harken back, that are historical, that present a different world with its pressures that may be very different from the pressures of today, could also be instructive for kids that way. Some historically situated programs.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there's, again, that gives us the license to still feel safe and yet also address the issue in a way that you don't have to think that hard to say, oh, wait a minute, what we're going through now, but it gives you a little bit of that distance for a kid so that it doesn't quite feel so sort of so onerous to say, oh my God, that's us. That's, us sheltering in. We're also looking at more in short form than in long form, continuing to do things that really, partly because we can only shoot things at the moment virtually. So, you do have two actors on two different screens, but looking again at sort of the positive way. We had done a series last year, which were sort of sleepovers with a couple of kids, our cast, where they were in the same space and they did the typical kind of things that girls do when they have, weekend sleepovers. And we're looking at how do we do that and do it in a virtual way. So, well, we can't be together in your den, but we're going to have a virtual sleepover, which again sort of references why we can't be together, but yet also bring some fun and lightness to it. So I think there's a question for you, Ellen, but I need the same thing that you did before, Near, which is just from a developmental standpoint, where is the line between what the content is? Is there any way to keep between what pandemic content is developmentally appropriate and inappropriate? So,
well, for any age child and for adults as well, fear-mongering is not what you want. So when you present any of the content in a way that is frightening, without some sort of way of assuaging that frightening, that's not helpful to anyone. The message really, I think there are a few messages that we're all in this together, that it is something we can manage. Kids need to hear that, even the young children, that we don't know what's going to happen. I think you have to be honest, even with the young children, to say that we don't know what's going to happen. I think it is never developmentally appropriate to lie to your children, even the young ones. If we don't know, we should say that. And I think that it's appropriate for parents, even though they don't want to say it, to say that they don't know what's going to happen and they're doing their best to cope. And then one of the most important things, particularly with the young kids, is to hold them when you say these things. It's frightened, is to comfort them physically. Is there something that's inappropriate other than the fear mongering? I really think that's the only thing I would stress as being inappropriate. And of course, it's always hard to talk about if there are people who are sick in your family or friends that you know. It's always difficult to talk about death and illness. And so COVID is not any different in that sense. And you have to be honest with children then that they won't see their friends, they won't be able to see them. I remember when Sesame Street did that wonderful program about Mr. Hooper's death. And here they were talking to 4- and 5-year-olds about death and did it quite eloquently and in a way that the children understood. So even the worst aspects of the COVID virus, of the incredible number of fatalities that we have over it, I think we have to be honest with our children and talk about it in a way that is, I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry, got rid of it. That was my sister-in-law. Sorry about that. So I think that's the only thing that isn't developmentally appropriate, is to ever lie to children, is to ever. I'm sorry about that.
There you go. It's live TV, you know?
Yes. I sent her a note saying I was going to be on TV. Well, at any rate. So I answered that question. Do you agree with me with that, Nancy?
No, absolutely. The lying to children, for sure. The mother of three. Sometimes you want to lie to your yes. I mean, that's, I think, what we all want, without being duplicitous or misleading or naive. But we all want to feel hopeful, right? You want to see that there's some sense of optimism of that. Yes, this is tough. This is going to hit a lot of people in many different ways. You know, not only just the terrible impact, obviously, if you lose somebody close to you, but, you know, for our audiences and the world at large, the impact of being out of work, the impact of the financial stresses. These are things that, you know, do trickle down even to the youngest kids. They know when things are not right, you know, from a financial stability perspective, and the kids who are already in at-risk groups. In terms of that. So, I mean, I feel like that's.
And we shouldn't point out, I mean, the data that just came out this week, that 1/5 of American children are hungry and are not getting the kind of nutrition. So children are suffering. So it's not just talking about COVID, it's actually helping them cope with the incredible stressors in their life that have to do with the economic situation. And I'm really concerned about the issue about hunger in young kids, whether they're going to get what they need in terms of nutrition, and will we step up as a society to take care of these children?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's a question for me saying, what kinds of character strengths should we focus on in our storytelling in a post-COVID world? Would resilience or independence be good ones to focus on? Resilience, for sure. I think that's, you know, something that we have looked at in storytelling for kids long before COVID. Obviously, it is, I think there's, Ellen, you probably know better than certainly I do, the research around resilience for kids and you know, the impact that has long-term on their success and their abilities to thrive. So it's something we've always sort of tried to model. I think the best thing that, you know, children's content does is to model the behaviors that you hope kids will bring into their own lives.
Yes.
So absolutely, I feel like resilience, flexibility, you know, that ability to change depending on what's happening and what's in front of you, and not feel stuck in a particular sort of routine and a particular point of view. Those are certainly things. And I think
mistakes and you have failures, but you can have successes after failures. That's the resiliency issue, and that children have to learn that even adults, we all make mistakes. We all have to pick ourselves up and move on. Yeah, and children are resilient. Fortunately, we're very lucky that they are. But yeah, we do need to take that on, and Disney does that very well, I must say. Yes, I agree.
Yeah. And I think the other piece is compassion. I mean, in terms of, you know, when we look at, for this moment in time, for sure, just having that compassion, having that empathy for the people who maybe are not quite as lucky and have been as safe as we are. I feel like that's an important value that we should be modeling all the time, but especially now when we know that there are going to be so many millions of people who, in fact, are really stressed and hurting from the impact of all of this. Sometimes, you know, especially older kid programming the characters can sometimes, you get the mean girl, you get the mean clique, right. You get who's cool, not the bully. And so, yes, those are realities. And that I think also goes to, you know, not necessarily lying or sugarcoating things for your kids, because you're going to have to deal with that. There's going to be a bully. There's going to be somebody who's not nice to you, but really paying attention to what the response to that is and where you get your strength from, and how your community, how your family, how your friends sort of react and rally around you is really important, and to show that sort of empathetic side to kids who don't always naturally come across as empathetic, especially when you're talking about high school and middle school.
I also think that the extent to which COVID and this experience is allowing and encouraging and indeed enabling families to be together, that the whole issue of how families interact is something that should be taken up afterwards, and that there are many different kinds of families and sorts of families, and what it means to rely on families. I think we're experiencing a difference in terms of recent family life from family life 20, 30 years ago, and in a post-COVID world, family life may be different as well.
Great. Question for you, Ellen.
Yes.
What advice would you give to parents who are trying to use media to both entertain and educate their children while they are unable to attend school?
Well, first of all, please don't be afraid of those screens that your kids are attending to, whether it's on their iPad or the television or on phones, wherever it is. There is nothing inherently wrong with screens so long as they're doing things more than just attending to screens all day long. And I understand if they're spending a lot of time on Zoom or on Google schools because they're doing everything online for their schools over the next month or two while they're still in school, that you want to limit the amount of time they use it for entertainment. But I really think that's something you should negotiate. And depending on the age of the child, the negotiations could be differently. So the first rule is, yes, they're attending to screens. Don't be hysterical about it, parent. It's okay. Screens aren't inherently bad. It depends on what they're doing with it. Two, do try to negotiate how much time they're going to spend. And if they're spending 4 or 5 hours a day on doing educational materials, well, you don't want them spending another 4 or 5 hours a day doing entertainment. And if you're dealing with an adolescent, that's something that you should set a family negotiation about, that you'll say you can have another 2 hours or whatever it is. And remember, screens are not just entertainment. Kids need them to get in touch with their friends. If they're not seeing their friends in schools, or they're not seeing their friends on the outside on the playground, then they have to have an opportunity for social time. I think the real issue is, you know your child as a parent, so you need to judge your child. The younger the child, the more limited time they should spend on screens, certainly under age 6. Middle school children, that's when the development of their social life is really important. So they probably want to spend some time, not just on schooling, but also having some social experiences on screens. And adolescents, well, by then you're into a whole other world of peer relations. Some things that I would limit no screens around mealtime, so that you have time with the family. No screens at night when they go to bed, nothing in their bedrooms, or at least an hour before they go to bed. And trying to make sure that every day there's family time that is not screen related, to do things, go out, read a book if it's a young child, take a walk with your child, play with a ball in the backyard if you have a backyard, so that you have time that's other than just screen time. But this is not the moment to beat ourselves up about keeping very strict limits of how much time your child can spend on screens, because it's one of the ways that we're accessing the world right now, and we should all be happy that we have this opportunity. Yeah. Otherwise, we would be extraordinarily isolated, as unfortunately some people are.
No, absolutely. And I'm so heartened because so many people are reaching out to talk about how they are spending time as a family. And, teenagers, certainly, tend to run up to their room, get on their phone, and, you don't see them except maybe if they come down for dinner. But it seems that families are sort of interacting in ways that they wouldn't ordinarily. And not just the parents are appreciative of it, but the kids are appreciative.
Cooking together, they're playing board games together, they're talking together, they're doing sports together, doing a lot more things as a family, which is really quite healthy. So I think there will be a change in the social life of families as a consequence of this, that we've rediscovered the joy of family life.
You sort of needed the push and the excuse to sort of disengage from everything that we were sort of programmed to believe was the way families interact. I think people just have a chance to reassess, like, how do we want to behave as a family, and what do we
There was a question for both of us from Jenna. Nir, could you put that up again so I could see the end of it, please? What other historical events are comparable to the pandemic and affecting both content and media use by children? Well, 9/11 was somewhat comparable, I would say, wouldn't you?
Yes, I have to say, and I've been in this business for 25 years. I don't think anything has ever affected us clearly in the way that this has, with 9/11 or Katrina or Hurricane Sandy. It was localized, not that we didn't know about it, obviously, if you didn't live in New York or New Orleans, but there was a way where it both didn't feel like it impacted and hit you that specifically if you didn't live in one of those areas, and it seemed like it would be over. There was a way to say, you know what, we'll rebuild, there will be impact, but we will come out of this, and life may not change that much, except if you were very, very specifically and personally impacted. You lost somebody in one of those events. This, I think, whether or not you've lost somebody, whether or not you're in New York or in a place that's been less affected, I think it will change us in ways that I don't think we've ever seen, certainly in this century. Maybe going back to the pandemic of 1918, but that was a different world entirely. So I think there's not just, I don't mean this in necessarily a nihilistic or pessimistic way, but I don't think there's any turning back from this. I think what the choices that we're going to be making going forward in terms of content in many ways will have to be impacted by who we are, what's happened to us, how our business goes forward, and what stories we want to tell, how we want to talk about it with kids.
Well, historians have certainly talked about how the 1918 pandemic and World War I fundamentally changed women's roles, for instance, and expectations about how you lived your life and you went out beyond the family. And in the same way, the Second World War had a difference in the way we thought about education for women and men, for jobs, for all kinds of things that came into our lives that we didn't expect. And I agree with you. Those were traumatic events for sure. But this somehow is different. In the sense the pandemic went on and we didn't know when it was going to end, but this sheltering in place, the closing down of the economy, I do wonder what kind of impact this is going to have on today's children, and what concerns they're going to have as they grow older, of what things they think will be possible, what things they will want to affect, and what things they will think will be less possible. And I can't predict what that's going to be like, but I know there'll be lots of people wanting to study it, and lots of people like you, Nancy, will want to make stories and narratives to help both the adults and the growing children cope with that new world. But it's going to be different. I absolutely agree. It's going to be different. I know in my own profession, universities are going to be quite different.
Absolutely. And I think the cohort that I sort of feel the most for in some ways are those high school seniors and those college seniors who are missing out on those milestones that, whether or not you went to the senior prom or you loved going to the senior prom or your graduation, those are real important milestones in your life, and not only missing them, but also not having any certainty of what's next. Am I going to go to that college that I was dying to go to and got accepted? Is it going to be real classes or online classes? I've graduated. I'm put myself, for many of them, in gigantic debt to complete college. What are my options for a job? I think that generation is truly going to have a psychological shift about how they see the world.
I agree, and it's this disruption in our ability to plan on what we expect to be the social life we're going to have, what we expect to be the milestones. If we can't plan for those, what are we going to be planning for? And the ways in which your hopes and plans for the future, your expectations are going to change, and we don't know how. Yeah.
Exactly. So I have a question from Sam on the Youth Council. Will streaming become more mainstream? Will box office movies go directly to houses? Will movie theaters go out of business? Wow, if I had all of those answers, Sam, they would pay me a lot more money. But the first one I would say is I don't think movie theaters are going to go out of business. I know personally I crave the experience of being in a theater and seeing a movie with other people. And I feel like that is something, that community, that collegiality, the going into hearing an audience laugh at a movie or hearing the sniffles at the end of an emotional movie. I think people will still want to do that. I think it will be very different, certainly until we have the protocols and the safety and the that we can gather in that larger group. And it may take us a while, so you may not be sitting right next to a stranger, but I think that that desire to have community around art in one way or another is something that's pretty deep-seated in all of us. In terms of,
I would point out that in the 50s, early 50s in particular, when television came along and it became the majority of households by the late 50s, there was much speculation that movies would go away because people could watch everything at home. And that never happened, because you're absolutely right. The experience of movie going is a social, communal experience, and we don't have enough of those in many ways in the society. So I think you're right. Physically how we do it may change.
exactly.
I don't think it'll go away either.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that this particular, experience has given us, it's really put into relief how much we have given up on some ways on that sort of social interaction and become more isolated. And now you're sort of craving that connection again.
Yes.
I know for myself, I'm talking to friends on a more reliable basis. We're doing it via Zoom calls instead of just sending a text, every couple of weeks. Hey, how are you doing? I'm making an effort because I'm craving that social connection. Streaming, I think streaming was on its way to becoming the preferred method of consuming content on a screen at home well before this. We've certainly seen that in the television, linear landscape, just where the audience was moving. Young people have moved and are continuing to move in droves to not just the streaming services, but YouTube and the accessibility of that. So I think that was the path it was going. This will probably accelerate it to some extent, but I think it was already on its way to very deliberately moving in that way.
Yeah, so social science, and the scientist in me wants to say that I just did this year focus group with 60 adolescents, 13 to 17, and I asked them about television. Not one of those kids watch television on a television set.
Yeah.
And they don't watch over-the-air broadcast TV. They're watching things, as you said, on YouTube. They're live streaming it. They're on Netflix, on their iPads. And I thought that was really interesting. I believe we're supposed to mention.
Yes, this is a live stream. You were tuned into a live stream from the Center for Scholars and Storytellers. My God.
Okay. Excellent. How do we normalize failure is the question.
I'll let you take that one.
Well, I think that I think failure is always a part of our lives, and it's definitely a part of growing up. I don't know that humans want to normalize it, but we certainly have to cope with it. And perhaps through this, we'll be coping with it a little bit more vocally than we have in the past. So one thing is you talk about failure, you don't ignore it. You support kids who are going through failure experiences by telling them how you made it through other experiences, helping them think through how they'll get through it. I don't know that that's normalizing it, because we don't want to fail, but we all do. And so we just have to find good ways of accepting that failure is a part of living, and we all have to learn to cope with it. So, in fact, isn't it the case that many narratives for children do deal with failures that are overcome? That's kind of an arc in many of the children's stories, yes.
Yeah, it goes back to what we were talking about in terms of that resilience and the grit. We put kids from a story perspective in situations where they're not going to succeed the first time, and they might not succeed the second time, or they have to cope with losing the sport event, not getting the whatever it is they wanted, trying and failing. And
right.
And as we talked about, sort of the modeling of having that tenacity to try again, to not let it crush you. You feel it, and you don't want to say, oh well, too bad, but to model that, there you can move beyond the failure and look toward a success, I think is something
there is a lot of research in learning sciences about the importance of grit, of really working to try to get through things. Could I have that question again? I think it's for you, Nancy.
I think it's for both, but I've got it up on my window, so it's really great. It says, what kinds of psychological research is going to be most important to storytellers in planning content surrounding this pandemic? From the story I think, many of the things, Ellen, that you're involved in, and I, definitely want to stay in touch and hear what your research tells, because I think what will be very helpful is hearing about what the impact of this is on the emotional stability and the emotional outlook of kids, and how much do they want to talk about it? How much do they want to put it behind them? How much information do they need to make them feel safe again? I think those are issues that I can see sort of needing to really understand, so that as we're crafting stories, we know what the right levers are and what the right tonality is. For us, tone is almost as important as narrative. Sort of, you can tell a specific story in many different ways with various different tones. And obviously the Disney tone is to be hopeful and optimistic without necessarily being, mindful of reality. So.
Yeah. Well, I think that the growth of what's been called tough topic television, tough topic programming for kids, 13 Reasons Why, was an example of that in the last few years, of dealing with issues like suicide in a teenage adolescent show, opened the door for much more explicit, tough topics. And I think the post-COVID world is going to be a tough topic that we have to deal with, and we'll deal with it differently for the younger children, the middle schooler and the adolescent. But being hopeful is what all of that kind of programming is. And we know that tough topics, adolescents in particular, want to talk about those things. They want to talk about those issues. Going back to that focus group that I ran with these 60 kids, I was shocked by how many of the kids, the adolescents in our interviews, almost I'd say 15-20% had known somebody who either attempted suicide or committed suicide. And the lives that they were describing was a pretty tough life. And it's not just that schooling's hard, but the world for adolescents, the world for kids today is a hard world. It's a tough world.
We got, I think, what's going to probably be the last question, but I'm asking Near, but hold on one second. But the question is, Hi,
you guys. This last question and wrap it up.
Okay.
You've both been amazing, and we've learned a lot, and it's wonderful to know that two people in both of your fields care so much about the health and well-being of young people. One of our last questions comes from someone from our youth council named Sophia. And I think it's a nice way to wrap it up, because often we have a lot of students and other people watching our live streams. So she says, at what part in your life did you realize this was the career path you wanted to take? And then I'm just going to add, because I know somebody in the youth council asked this, they also said, in particular, being the boss. When did you guys want to become the boss and realize that was what you wanted to do?
I'll take it first. Always wanted to be the boss. You can talk to my mother about that. If my father was still alive, he said, you never really were much of a child. You always were a little adult. But I did not know that I would land here as a sort of network television executive. That was definitely never in my life plan. It happened quite serendipitously in some ways. But I knew from a pretty early age, I was always a giant reader. I loved books. I'd sit in the library for, hours at a time. And then made my first movie when I was in the 7th grade with a 16 millimeter camera that my dad had. And it was a very deep and powerful anti-war movie. It was that starred my 3-year-old brother at the time. So,
I think there's a screening in our future.
I knew that I wanted to be, I knew I wanted to tell stories. I didn't know that I wanted to tell them for kids. And that's not where my career started. But I knew that I would be a storyteller in some way from a pretty early age. And then the career path to here is we would need a whole other hour chat for me to discuss that.
Well, I knew I wanted to do research once I went to graduate school. I wanted to be an actress early in my life, so I did little theater when I was in high school, and I had dance classes and singing classes. And I went off to college as a theater major to the University of Pittsburgh, and discovered within my first quarter that I wasn't as good as some of the other kids who were in that program, and I was pretty bookish compared to them. Mm-hmm. And so I got out of theater very quickly because I didn't want to do anything I couldn't be great at. And then I wanted to be a community organizer, and I actually went to graduate school just to get a master's degree in communication to learn how to manipulate the press if I was going to become a community organizer. Instead, I got involved in research my first term there, decided to get a PhD, and never looked back. And I'm very lucky that I love what I do.
That's
the most important part.
And just as a personal question, Nancy, like, and particularly, why do you think content creators who make content for 6 and up don't use research as much? And what are the ways that we can encourage them to see as a support system, as a way to really understand? I love that you asked, how do we, understand the emotional needs of youth moving forward, and how can stories serve that? Which I know for me growing up, it served me, and many youth it serves them. So how can we encourage and support more collaborations across these two disciplines?
Yeah, I think, and it's interesting because when I came into neither on the preschool side nor on the older kids side, where they really invested wholeheartedly in the role that research could play, and that collaboration between academics and experts. I, was trained in the Sesame model, so I had just a deep-seated belief that should be part of it, and I was able to affect that on the preschool side, where it's always been a little more accepted and part of the process, certainly at Sesame. I think the fear has been on the older kids side that once you start that relying too much or involving too much academic or expert advice starts to make your product into broccoli. Like it's going to be too messagey. It's going to feel too schooly. With little kids, they don't care. They don't know. You give it to them and they take it in. And the idea of learning something from watching something on television is exciting for them. Whereas the traditional thinking is if kids, 6, 8, 10-year-olds smell that you're trying to teach them something, they're going to say, no, I'm out of school. I don't want to do that. I personally have taken it as part of my role to start to change that and to really forge the kind of mutual respect and understanding that we can have for each other, and that writers who tend to say, don't tell me how to write, I know how to write a story for a 10-year-old. Really, when you expose them to what academic research and expert consultation can do to deepen story, they're sort of surprised. But, you're working with a community of people who haven't done it typically. And so their initial reaction is like, I don't want some teacher telling me how to write a story. But you can, you make progress. I know some of the people that we work with, Yalda and yourself, who we really rely when we're tackling in particular a subject matter, whether it's adoption or divorce or something like the pandemic, or when we're talking about a specific cultural group that we're not necessarily a part of, we're starting to make movement and get acceptance to say, we need that outside advice. We need people who are deeply knowledgeable and steeped in this to help inform this to you, the creator, to make that entertaining and make that meaningful. But without that, we're sort of in a vacuum. But
and I think there's both ways. The respect can also go from the academic to the storyteller. Mm-hmm. Having been in the storytelling business, storytellers have an enormous ability to engage audiences, and there's a lot that academics offer that storytellers know intuitively. But there is a place for really good research, I think, and for counterintuitive findings and also for authenticity. And unfortunately, it's already 2:01. You guys have been amazing. Thank you so much. We are going to end, and we have lots and lots of questions. And this will be up on the CSS website, our YouTube channel, and we turn it into a podcast too.
That's great.
We'll have many opportunities to learn about everything that we've learned, and we'll have another one of these next month. Thanks so much.
Great to see you, Nancy. Thank you, Yalda.
Everybody,
Thanks,
bye.
Alan. Soon, Yalda, talk to you all soon.
Thank
Thank you.